So analyzing the relationship between variables, and you'll have a dependent variable and an independent variable, and we'll get into the lesson. You'll understand the relationship between those two. Really continuing to carry on what we've done with social studies as far as lessons in things like cause and effect, and you're going to see a lot about correlation in this lesson. Also, kind of reinforcing the idea that correlation does not imply causation. And there's going to be other factors that we have to consider when we're looking at, data. And particularly when we're dealing with variables like this, it's going to be shown in a graph. Most typically, it's going to be some type of visual data like that, and the other factors that might be involved. So it's really about pulling your critical thinking skills in when you are presented with information like that. Like, is this all that there's going to be? Is this one relationship being affected by this other one, or this variable being affected by the other one, or could there be other things that are influencing it? So let's go ahead and take a look here.
Hello there. Welcome to the lesson on analyzing the relationship between variables. This lesson will teach you how to analyze and communicate how dependent and independent variables are related. Before we get started, let's talk about variables. What is a variable? Well, a variable is something with a changeable value or state. The money in my checking account is a variable. Whenever I get paid, my checking account goes up. When I pay my bills, my checking account goes down. So the amount of money in my checking account varies because it's a variable. Variables are important because they show how two things relate to each other. They make it easier to understand how and why things happen. A few years ago, our state decided to give our public school teachers a 7% raise. In the years following the pay raise, there was a huge drop in the number of teachers who gave up teaching. So increasing one variable, the salary of public school teachers, seemed to reduce another variable, the number of public school teachers who gave up teaching. The relationship was clear. By identifying and analyzing these relationships, you learn how different ideas are connected. Now I know, at least in my state, that there is a relationship between how much a teacher is paid and how many teachers decide to quit teaching that year. Does that mean that increasing one variable is causing the other variable to go down? Well, maybe, or maybe not. Variables can get kind of complicated. Here, let me show you.
Yeah, so first off, right, a variable, no matter whatever it is, it's something that's going to change. I mentioned, we talked about the housing issues in the late 2000s, and variable rate mortgages, right? So variable meant that those rates were going to change. So that's all variable is. It's just something that's going to change. It's not fixed. And we're going to have two, right? And she'll discuss, how those interact. And yes, so that's what the other thing, this is a great example. So the increase in pay, right? The teachers got a pay raise, so they saw less teachers quitting. So there's, a relationship. You could show that on a graph. But, you have to consider maybe there's other factors there. So when you're visualizing, sort of simple data like that, that's the thing. You can always want to question, is there other factors there that might be related to that? Maybe there's other things that improve the working conditions for the teachers. Maybe the benefits as well as the pay got better. There's other things there that might be a factor. And it's always something to kind of consider when you're looking at that type of data.
So let's talk variables. The two most common types of variables are the independent variable and the dependent variable. An independent variable is a variable that can influence other variables. A dependent variable is a variable influenced by an independent variable. I like to think of the independent variable as a light switch and the dependent variable as a lamp. In this example, you change the independent variable by flipping the light switch. This causes the dependent variable, the lamp, to give off light. You might even have one light switch connected to multiple lamps. One independent variable can influence multiple dependent variables. To keep things from getting too confusing though, you want to analyze one independent variable at a time. An independent variable is called independent because it isn't influenced by another variable. The dependent variable, on the other hand, depends on the independent variable to change it. That means the relationship only goes one way. The light switch can turn on the lamp, but the lamp can't flip the light switch. Makes sense, right? Not all independent variables need someone to flip a switch though. Some change naturally over time. In fact, time itself is a pretty common independent variable. Look here. This graph shows the changing American workforce between 1900 and 2000. Everything you see here is a variable: agriculture jobs, industrial jobs, service jobs, and time. All of these variables can change. Since 1900, American labor has shifted over to service sector jobs. When graphing a relationship between variables, it's pretty common to put the independent variable along the bottom axis, like this. Notice that for each year there are 3 dependent variables. So there's one variable for 1950 and 1, 2, 3 variables for job sectors. The one independent variable, time, is influencing multiple dependent variables. Keep in mind that not all relationships between variables will be cause and effect relationships, like the light switch example. Most relationships are a correlation. That means that the independent variable is influencing the dependent variable in some way. That might mean a cause and effect relationship, but not always. In this example, time isn't causing the increase in service industry jobs. There are a whole bunch of social and economic factors influencing whether these job sectors increase or decrease in size, but we're only tracking the one independent variable, time. As time advances, the dependent variables also change. That's the relationship between these variables. So what do you say? Do you think you're ready to analyze some basic relationships between variables?
Okay, I want to back up here, take a look at this. So, as she mentioned, it's just a generally agreed upon convention. There's nothing written in stone about this, but most of the time, almost every single time that you see a graph, okay, the independent variable will run across the horizontal axis on the bottom. It'll be on the x-axis across the bottom. The dependent variables will be displayed on the vertical. Okay, it's just when in visualizing data like that, it's just something that's kind of agreed upon, just like with a map, right? You look at a map, it's typically facing north, right? You're not going to jail if you get a map upside down, but it's just generally agreed upon. That's the way people kind of understand them. So, your best bet, if you get a question about, if you get a question about, what's the independent variable, right? It's likely it's a safe bet to say it's going to be on the horizontal axis. Okay. If you're trying to identify it, independent, likely to be on the horizontal, dependent's going to be on the vertical, right, up and down. And the other thing, right, you're only going to have one independent variable represented on a graph, and you could understand why, right? I can't start putting a bunch of different independent variables on there that are trying to influence what's going on in the dependent variables. I can't put time and then changes in climate and something else. It's too much information. We want one independent variable affecting the dependent variables. You can have a variety of dependent variables, right? You can show different things. And that's why one reason time is such a common independent variable to see, because we often show on graphs, changes over time. Okay. And something else is history here to go along with our graph, this particular graph. So as she says, like, time isn't the reason that we have more service jobs, but it's a good way to show the increase of service jobs over that time period, and the decrease in agriculture and the decrease in industry. But what we also know here, the reason we see these increases and decreases, agriculture, for instance, we see where 40% of the labor sector in 1900, almost 40% was in agriculture. Now it's probably like that's about 5% maybe, because of automation, because of better agricultural practices, more science involved in it. So there's less people needed to work a farm. And there's less people who farm today, who are in the agricultural field, and a lot of that has to do with automation, machinery, more machines doing the job, requiring less people. It's a little scary sometimes when we look at how little amount of people work in agriculture and how much food they're responsible for the world, honestly. But that's why you see that decrease. More automation, less need for people, better machinery, better ways to transport agricultural goods and things like that. So less people working in that industry. We also talked about in the 1800s, when it really started. If you took that graph into the 1800s, you'd even have more people working in agriculture. And we talked about African American population moving to urban areas, particularly in the north, right? So that one sector of labor, agricultural labor, was leaving the South, where there was a lot of farms, and looking for industrial jobs, or just work in the city. We see industrial jobs start to take a dip, probably around 1965 or so, as far as that graph is concerned. Certainly by the time we get to 1975, we see a large drop off, and that's because a lot of our industrial type jobs, a lot of manufacturing jobs, have been outsourced, right? A lot of stuff now is made overseas, so we see that drop. So as the cause and effect here, to some degree, we see a rise in service jobs, a huge rise, which where it was lower than agriculture in 1900, up to way more than half of the American population working in some type of service industry now. In 2000 anyway, so 22 years ago when this graph ended. So and that partly is due because those other jobs are we don't have a lot of people in them. There's not that type of availability in those industries, so people looking for work went into more service type industry then. So that's sort of helps explain the information you're seeing there. And time just marches forward, right? That's why it's a good independent variable, is because it never changes. And we'll keep going here.
What is the relationship between the variables shown in this graph?
Okay, so our graph for our question here. So what is the relationship between the variables shown in the graph? So the graph below shows the monthly U.S. employment rate for 2016 to 2017. Each value represents the unemployment percentage of the beginning of the month. Okay, so what is our dependent and independent variables? So if we were looking at a graph and we're getting questions about variables, we're going to say, okay, our independent variable, look at that horizontal line at the bottom, our x-axis running left to right, we have time, right? We have from January to December, we're showing a year's worth of time there represented monthly. So you want to think about the values as well, because that could be of interest to question or come up. And then our vertical, our up and down axis, our y-axis, we have percentage, right? So that is our dependent variable that is changing over time. And the blue is 2016. The red is 2017. And our values there for our dependent variables start at 4%, go up to 5.2%. So what are we seeing here over the course of 2016? A higher unemployment rate, right, based on the percentage of the labor force for the entire year of 2016, and a much lower one. I mean, you know, we get to 4.1% unemployment. We start, you know, you get down into the 3% area, and that's largely considered near full employment for the U.S. You're never going to have 0% unemployment. There's, again, various reasons for that, but those are actually, you know, decent numbers. By the time we get into like October of 2017, 4.1, we see a pretty good drop in the unemployment rate there, whereas it never got lower than 4.6 in 2016. Okay, so now our question, you know, what is the relationship between the variables shown in the graph? So the independent variable, right, we want to make sure that we understand, okay, the independent variable was time. So we can eliminate whatever, you know, options they may have here that does not have the independent variable as time. We have two here that say time. The independent variable month, you know, got to be careful. That is the value there, but that's not necessarily the independent variable. That doesn't really make sense. The independent variable is actually time, the movement of time. Independent variable time causes a reduction in the dependent variable unemployment. No. The independent variable time correlates to the dependent variable unemployment, right? It's very, you know, nuanced as far as the answer goes. But there is a correlation between the drop in unemployment rate and the time, just a correlation, right? Just because it's October doesn't necessarily mean that there was lower unemployment. Just because it was 2017 doesn't mean there was less unemployment. But what we're showing here is over the course of those 2 years where the unemployment rate was. So those two things are correlations. Okay, so the independent variable time correlates.
Good job. This graph has 2 years worth of data stacked atop one another. If you follow the blue line for 2016, it ends right where the line for 2017 picks up. The independent variable, which includes both month and year, is time. The dependent variable is unemployment rate. This is a correlation.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? If you're seeing whatever the value is, whether it's years, whether it's days, whether it's weeks, months, decades, centuries, if it's on the x-axis, it's talking about time, right? It's not talking about year or month or something like that. The independent variable is time.
Relationships between variables are pretty easy to understand when they're driven by one independent variable. That's why I recommend only analyzing one independent variable at a time. Limiting your variables means making sure that nothing is influencing your dependent variables other than your independent variable. For example, back in 2013, my state decided to add more polling centers to its southwestern counties. The government hoped that having more polling centers would allow more people to vote. Some people debated over whether or not the plan worked out. Take a look. This graph shows how many people voted in my state's southwestern counties from 2008 to 2016. The entries that we're most interested in are the ones after 2013, when the new polling centers were added. We want to see whether or not adding the new polling centers encouraged more people to come out and vote. Notice how some of these bars are shorter than the others? Those are midterm elections. They usually have lower turnouts. Still, it looks like more people voted in the 2014 midterm than in the 2010 midterm. That looks like improvement. Oh, but look here at 2016. Yikes. Voter participation dropped off by a lot that year. It looks like the new polling centers did nothing to improve the turnout for the general election. What if I told you, though, that Election Day 2016 had some really bad weather for my state? We had torrential rain and flooding throughout the day. Octavio and I practically had to take a boat to our polling center. There's a pretty good chance that the flooding discouraged people from voting. But you don't see any mention of flooding here in this graph, do you? That's because weather is a confounding variable. A confounding variable is an unplanned independent variable that complicates the relationship. For all I know, the voter turnout would have been even worse without the new polling centers. But because we have two independent variables, the new polling centers and bad weather, it's hard to say which one is having the greater influence. Confounding variables have this way of confusing what the data is saying. Anyway, that's it for confounding variables. Let's see if you got this.
Yeah, confounding variables, right? And that's a thing you have to look for. And you know, this is where data gets manipulated. You know, and politicians love to manipulate data, love to manipulate statistics. So, you know, if you were like she, you know, mentions here, right? You look at those numbers and you think, oh, wow, well, those polling places didn't work. And if you wanted to, you know, shutter some of those polling places down the road, you would pull this graph up and you could show us like, look, they had no effect on the 2014, or had very little effect on the 2014. And we actually saw less numbers in 2016. And without, you know, we talk about context, right? That's part of context, understanding confounding variables. Everybody loves to point out gas prices nowadays, and they're awful. It doesn't matter who you vote for, you know, what's your political affiliation. Nobody likes paying $5 a gallon for gas. You know, if you listen to a certain political party, it's all Joe Biden's fault. And then you'll see, you know, memes, and you'll see, you know, charts and data and everything about how March 2020 we were paying $1.80 for gas. Okay, well, there's plenty of confounding variables in that scenario, right? What were we all doing in March 2020? Nothing. We were all sitting at home. You know, there was no theaters open. Nobody was traveling. Gas prices, we talked about supply and demand. Nobody needed gas because nobody could go anywhere. Your Uber driver or your Uber Eats, you know, drivers were the only people using gas, or, you know, just because we were all sitting at home. So the demand for gas dropped significantly to the point where we were paying, you know, that super low amount for a few months because nobody could use gas. But you don't hear that when we talk about gas prices today. Why are they higher than they were, you know, before that or after that? Well, demand. Once we started, you know, the everything started coming back online, and production couldn't keep up. Demand was still, you know, really high, and supply was low. It still is, and that's where we get that today. So if you were to represent that on a graph, you know, you would show like your independent variable of time from 2020 to, you know, right now in 2022, and we could show, you know, gas prices, right? Our dependent variable, you know, fluctuating over that time. And you could mark, it's like, okay, well, here is where, Donald Trump was president. And then, last year, January 2021, here's where Joe Biden became president. And that's all you need to manipulate data. That's all it takes, without the rest of that information, without the context, right? So that's, how these things, why we talk about confounding variables and why it's important, because you also want to be able to show and question that data, right? You want to know, it's like, is that the whole story? So that's the case here, what they're dealing with and why that's important.
If you wanted to analyze the relationship between skipping breakfast and academic performance, which of these factors could be a confounding variable?
Right. So another really good example, right? So if you wanted to show, right, the skipping breakfast and academic performance. So let's say with, middle school kids, high school kids, college kids, whoever it may be. So you could say, let's see, what would your independent variable be? I guess the independent variable is the percent of, yeah, that would be the percentage of students who did not eat breakfast, right? I guess you could do this like a bar graph, right? And then show the numbers of, grade level, right? So, or average grade for those who ate breakfast compared to those who didn't, right? You only have like two categories. So, right, you have this one category, these students did not eat breakfast and they have a C average, and then these students ate breakfast and they have like a B plus average, real simple kind of idea there. Right. Well, there's all kinds of variables, honestly, that could, that confounds that information that are not, being factored into why you may have, students struggling, why academic performance may be low. So in this case, the confounding one would be, some of the students are getting poor sleep compared to the average. So that's going to affect whether you're eating or not eating breakfast is the amount of sleep. Everyone should get at least 8 hours of sleep, which is difficult. Certainly really important for children to get 8 to 9 hours of sleep. And compared to those other options there. So students vary widely in the kind of breakfast they typically eat. Yeah, that's not so much a confounding variable, not as much as poor sleep. Some of the students will not perform well academically. Well, I mean, there's other reasons where they were struggling, but there's not enough information there to make that a confounding variable. That's just a statement of fact, right? That's not necessarily a variable. Some of the students are quite a bit older than is average for the group. That doesn't matter, right? That's out of bounds of what the study is indicating or what they're trying to show. So age in that case, unless they're 100 years old or something like that, that's not going to be an effect. But sleep certainly can be a confounding variable. How much? Now that's the other thing you're looking for, right? If we're talking about a confounding variable, that means it changes. Not performing well, that doesn't have a rate of change to it. Types of breakfast they're eating doesn't have a rate of change to it. Students being older than other students, I mean, there's a change between the age groups, but that doesn't speak to the information that we have and that we're trying to represent. So that leaves some of the students are getting very poor
Great
sleep.
job! Yes! Lack of sleep can negatively impact academic performance. If your students did poorly on their academic test, it might be because they skipped breakfast or might be because they didn't sleep well. This is a confounding variable.
Yeah, I mean, there's other factors as well that could be confounding, but that certainly are it really speaks to the idea there that they're trying to represent. Okay, so now we have our
Very good work on
questions.
those exercises. Now it's time to do some practice. You can show what you've learned and maybe learn even more.
All right. So let's take about, because there's some data to look at and everything, we'll go about 15 minutes and take your time, look at the questions, and look at the information that's provided. Most of them will have a graph that goes along with it. So we'll go to about 105. I will pause. All right. So just first question was looking for the relationship between the variables shown in the graph. And our information at the top there basically talking about the census data showing the percent of young people ages 19 to 26 living at home with their parents at different points in time. So 1990, 2001, and 2009. And then it adds, some experts believe that this graph shows how the 2008 financial crisis impacted young people, which, I've talked about here and there, the Great Recession around that time, starting in 2008. So what we have then, of course, on the bottom, right, we can look, we can say that's going to be the independent variable. And sure enough, it is time, which typically is a independent variable. And then the percentage is on the vertical axis there. So, from 0 to 80%. And, the blue are the people in that age range who live at home. The red are the individuals who do not. And we see those 3 years there represented, 1990, 2001, 2009. So we see that sort of invert, right? So everything 1990 only had about 33% of adults 19 to 26 living at home. 67% on their own, 31% in 2001, 69% does not live with their parents. So it actually, less were living at home, less were living at home in 2001 than even 1990. And then we see a pretty dramatic shift. So 58% living with their parents in 2009, and only 42% not living at home. So our independent variable, right, is time. We already know that right away. It correlates to the dependent variable living with parents. So the independent variable is time, correlates to the dependent variable living with parents. Okay. And which of the following would be a confounding variable that might call into question or confuse what the data seems to be showing, right? So confounding variable means it's complicating that relationship. It's influencing that relationship. It needs to be accounted for. And our choices, if one of the young person's parents has passed away, creating a greater burden on the remaining parent, no. If young people are moving home, not for financial security, but to care for their aging parents, possibility. If young people are living with their parents, but not in the same residence they grew up in, completely irrelevant, right? That is not relevant at all to our idea here. That would still be considered, even if your parents moved, you moved back with them, whether they moved out of state or something like that, quote unquote, living at home. So that's irrelevant. If the young person has one or more siblings between 19 and 26 years of age who also live at home, no, because they're already part of that data set, right? They're already represented as one of those other people. So that doesn't have any factor. That's out of bounds. So if young people are moving home, not for financial security, but to care for their parents, that is what we're looking for. The two best choices there are a little bit confusing because that could possibly be a confounding variable that you are moving at home to, help with your parents' economic burden. But in regards to the information that they gave, that it was the the young people that were being more impacted by the economic issues at the time. That leaves the confounding idea here to be, or the confounding variable to be, not moving at home for financial security, right? The other one still had a financial security element to it, but in this case, to help with that, like it says, the graph supposedly shows how young people struggled after the financial crisis. So that's the context of the graph. So that you have to keep in mind there. And then how did the dependent variables change while influenced by the independent variable? So, during the influence of the independent variable, there was an increase in young people living with their parents. So during the influence of the independent variable, yeah, there was an increase in young people living with parents. These other options, as the independent variable increased, it caused the dependent variable to increase. No, because there's actually two dependent variables, right? Those living at home and those not living at home. So there's more than one. During the influence of the independent variable, there was little change in young people living with parents. No, we see a change in that. And then that first option, during the influence of the independent variable, there was an increase in young people living on their own. No, partially, but over time, if we go to 1990 to 2008, we see a decrease. There was a spike there around, what year was it? 2001. But after that, it decreased. So during the influence of the independent variable, there was an increase in young people living with their parents. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. Which of the following would be a confounding variable that might call into question or confuse what the data seems to be showing? So here, the city of River Clay conducted a study to determine its citizens' adoption of technology. The graph below shows the percentage of citizens who reported using the internet on a daily basis. The data suggests that older citizens are less inclined to use technology than their younger counterparts. Okay, so what is our independent? What is our dependent variable? Our independent variable still going to be on the horizontal, all right? We're not, I guess it's time related because we're talking about age, but we have age groups. So not affected by the dependent variable, right? It is independent. So we have our several age groups there. Our dependent variable are the percentage who are using technology, right? So based on age, we see a decline when we get to the 50, a huge decline. We see a little bit of a drop off between the 36 and 55-year-old set, but a more dramatic one, 56 to 65, and then 66 plus. So we're down below 50% in that 66 plus range. So what could confound that data? Right? Okay, we see less people who are older who are using technology, right? Using electronic devices, so forth and so on. Less inclined to use technology. Well, that's what it's saying, that they're less inclined. That's sort of implied by the data. So what can confound that? So most elderly in Riverdale live below the poverty line and do or cannot afford electronics. That is the right answer. What choices do we have here? Older River Clay citizens are often retired and so have more time to access the internet. Well, then you would actually see more, right? That would imply that there would be an increase in the amount of older citizens using technology. Middle-aged River Clay citizens tend to work full-time and so don't have time to use electronics. No, that is incorrect. Young River Clay citizens have been using electronic devices since they were very young. That's out of bounds of what we're seeing here. Doesn't necessarily matter because we also don't see a drop in some of those older sets. Who may not have that same access to technology when they were younger, but they still use it. Most elderly and river clay citizens live below the poverty line and so cannot afford electronic devices. That is the correct answer. See, the other problem, you know, I mentioned like the middle age, was it middle age? Yeah, using that, which would really not signal that one's difficult because also those other age groups would be working as well. And you can't single out that one particular age group to say, well, they're probably working. That doesn't really fit with what we have here, but this would influence that graph. Was the relationship between the variables shown in this graph? So back to our aging population and technology. Independent variable age correlates to the dependent variable internet usage, right? So we already identified our two variables. Independent, right, is age, it was on our horizontal axis, running left to right. The usage, technology usage or internet usage, whatever they want to call it, is the other variable. So independent variable internet usage. Okay, independent variable age correlates to the dependent variable internet usage. That's our correct answer. The relationship here has one or more confounding variables confusing this relationship. Yeah, but they're asking us about the relationship between the variables we have. Okay, so make sure you're always looking at the question and what they want you to answer. So what's the relationship between the two? That's what we need to answer. This third option, the independent variable internet usage, wrong right away, right? Because that is the dependent variable, not the independent variable. And then finally, the last one, the independent variable age causes an increase in the dependent variable internet usage. No, it would be invert, it would be flipped then, right? We would actually see more people over here using it and less people over here if it was increasing, if the dependent variable was increasing with the independent variable. That's not the case. So, and it's a correlation, right? Again, other factors, confounding variables. So the relationship is a correlation between age and usage. It's not causation. And what is the relationship between the variables shown in this graph? So big box stores. So big box stores, probably heard the term a lot, right? Which typically we're talking about those large department stores like Target, Walmart, Kmart, I guess is still around somewhere. But of course, nowadays it's mostly Walmart, Target. And then, you know, those are sort of department store type big box stores. We also consider Home Depot, Barnes and Noble. Those are all considered big box stores too, because they have large footprints and they're big corporations. So the relationship between the variables shown in this graph. A little bit of text here. The city of Ramford is considering a request to build a new big box store within its city limits. The city has been growing at an unprecedented rate and is desperate for greater commercial coverage that a big box store might provide. Currently, some citizens have to drive 30 or more minutes to reach a supermarket. Councilperson Andrew Espinoza, however, is reluctant to welcome a new big box store to the city. He feels that big box stores bring violent crime. To prove his point, he created a graph showing how violent crime has increased with each new big box store added to the city. So new big box stores versus crime report the year after a new store. That's the title of the graph. And oh my, so one big box store opens, you got less than 100 new crimes. You get 10 new big box stores open and your crimes are almost up to 500. Independent variable, number of box stores, big box stores opening. Dependent variable, crimes, right? Number of crimes. So crimes reported year after the new store opened. Okay. That's a problematic graph. Okay, and we're going to find out why. So, what is the relationship between the variables shown in the graph? So, the relationship has, in this case, one or more confounding variable confusing this relationship. That's the correct answer. Why is that the correct answer? The independent variable number of big box stores causes the dependent crimes to increase. There's just way too little information to say that. The independent variable crimes, right away, wrong, because that's the dependent variable. The independent variable crimes. So we're down to two options because I'm simply eliminating the fact that the independent variable is the number of big box stores. Okay, so the independent variable number of big box stores causes the dependent crimes to increase. That is a causation, right? We've talked about this over and over again. When it comes to variables like this, you're looking at correlation. You cannot say that, A causes B with two data points, basically. That's not nearly enough information. If that first answer said the independent variable number of big box stores correlates with the increase in crimes or the statistic of crimes, then we could choose that. But causing the dependent's crime to increase, we cannot say that. There we go. Yeah, the text mentions that the city has been growing rapidly. Larger cities means more people, more crimes, and more stores. It probably isn't the big box stores driving crime. Population growth is the missing confounding variable, right? So that's, really important. So to show the effect of population growth on the number of crimes reported, what variables should you look at? So let's get rid of the big box stores data, right? How will we look at crimes and population growth? So what we want is independent variable, several population growth tiers. So like maybe, how could you represent that? Percent growth in population, by city, something like that. So, you can have like, if Columbus's population growth over the last 10 years, however long you'd want to show that rate of change. That would be your independent variable. And then you can have Columbus, Cincinnati, Los Angeles, Chicago, whatever cities you want. How much have they grown or shrunk? And then next, your dependent variable, you could show crime, right? Number of crimes, whatever. So in that case, independent, several population tiers. The dependent then would be number of crimes reported for each tier, right? So just like I said. Right, so that would be number one. Independent, this next option here, years for which data is collected. That's no. That's not relevant. Dependent would be several population growth tiers. No, that needs to be your independent. Okay, you're replacing the big box store. You're keeping your crime, right? You're keeping your number, your crime number. So that's still going to be your dependent variable. Independent, years for which data is collected. No, if it was based on years or something, but that doesn't work. It doesn't give you the numbers you want. Number of crimes reported each year, that's fine. Independent, number of crimes reported. No, again, you're changing the independent dependent variables. You need to keep that as a dependent variable, right? You want to show a correlation between crime and whatever, number of ice cream cones eaten, whatever it may be, but that needs to stay the same. So independent, several population growth tiers. There we go. Yeah, your goal is to see how reported crimes change as population increased. Population is your independent variable. The dependent variable is the crimes reported at different population levels. And that's a good one to show that it's not always time, right? You can have other independent variables, but your independent variable is influencing your dependent variable. Okay, and then finally, if you were looking at the effect of population growth on the number of reported crimes, what sort of confounding variables should you look out for? So any variable that could potentially affect the number of crimes being reported. See, which one is that? Any variable that could potentially affect the number of crimes being reported in the data set, right? So that last one, right? Poverty levels. You know, is there a opioid epidemic in that area? You know, those are other factors that are going to influence crime, not just population, certainly not the number of big box stores, right? Big box stores is showing population growth. That's a better variable, independent variable than big box stores. The reason these other ones do not work, any variable that could potentially affect both the population numbers and the number of crimes. No, we need one of those to be independent variable. Any variable that could potentially affect either the population numbers or the number of crimes. Again, just like both, either or means that the independent variable would be influenced. Any variable that could potentially affect the population numbers reported in the data set. No, right? Again, that would be our independent variable. So we're not worried about that. We're worried about what's changing crime, right? That's confounding. That's the confounding variable. Just like I said, right? There's numerous things that could affect that. Right? The number of crimes is the dependent variable. That's what could be influenced by other variables. So you don't want anything affecting the dependent variable other than the independent variable, which is very difficult to do. All right, those were the answers. So, the first and foremost, the thing to remember when we're talking about variables, the independent variable is not influenced by the dependent variable. It stands alone. It's isolated. You're going to recognize that because it's going to be on the left or right, horizontal axis on a graph. It's a way to indicate it. Your dependent variable, right, is influenced. It is not caused by. That's the key there. It is influenced. It correlates with the independent variable, right? That it depends on the independent. Great way to remember it. It's vertical. It's on that y-axis. Confounding variables. Things that are missing that can influence the dependent variable. So, just like we said, if it's crime, lots of factors that's going to affect a crime rate or number of crimes in an area, not just population, right? Population growth, a lot of people move to new areas because there's low crime, right? So there has to be other factors other than just people in an area. But that's where we get into, the trouble when you're just representing graphical information like that. When you have two data sets, when you have, one correlating with the other one, a lot of times there's other things going on. And, that's, again, thinking about our kind of critical thinking and applying our knowledge there. So what else could be affecting it? And sometimes, if you're doing this for your own reasons, you would want to, do a little investigation, do a little research as to why that is. Okay, any questions on our social studies lesson today? So on, your social studies GED test, you're not going to have 40 questions on independent variables, right? Or correlating data. It will show up. It's very likely it's fair game to be on your exam. But what's important about it is, sort of how it folds into the other lessons on critical thinking, right? And applying that knowledge and looking at visual data. So we're getting more sort of practice in understanding visual data there. All right, so we're just about time here. We'll take a break, about 10-minute break, and we'll hit up language arts at 1:40 if there are no questions. Okay, I'll see you guys back for language arts at 1:40 then.